In the spring of 1868, Republicans carried Louisiana's St. Landry Parish by 678 votes. Black men, most of them only recently freed from slavery, were registering, organizing, and voting. They were helping to build a political order that would have been unthinkable before the Civil War. 7 months later, in the presidential election, Republican Ulysses S. Grant received no recorded votes in the parish. Not a small minority. Not a few scattered ballots. 0. Between those elections came one of the deadliest campaigns of political terror during Reconstruction, the Opelousas Massacre. No reliable final count of the dead exists. Contemporary reports ranged from a few dozen to several hundred. Federal investigators confirmed mass executions and killings across the parish. Modern histories commonly estimate more than 100 victims, and sometimes around 250, overwhelmingly black. But the purpose of the violence can be measured with terrible clarity. It broke the local Republican organization, drove people from their homes, and made a Republican vote potentially fatal. The story begins with the transformation that followed emancipation. Under the Reconstruction Acts and Louisiana's new Constitution, black men gained political rights in the state before the 15th Amendment was ratified. They attended meetings, joined political clubs, helped choose officials, and prepared to vote in the 1868 presidential election. Black political life in Louisiana was new, contested, and diverse. It did not speak with one voice, but in St. Landry Parish, many black voters supported the Republican Party, which was associated with emancipation and Reconstruction. These rights did not arrive with a guarantee that they could be exercised safely. The federal government had rewritten the legal terms of citizenship in the former Confederacy, but the daily balance of power still depended on soldiers, officials, courts, employers, and neighbors. Former Confederates and other white conservatives remained embedded in local society. For a freedman, registering or marching with a political club could make his allegiance visible to the people who controlled land, jobs, credit, and, in many places, law enforcement. That made an election more than a private choice made on one day. Political power grew through a network. Meetings where voters learned the issues, organizers who maintained party ties, newspapers that challenged hostile accounts, and schools that represented a future beyond slavery. Destroying that network could shape an election before anyone reached the polls. White Democrats fought to recover the authority they had lost. Political pressure included threats from employers and businesses, racist appeals in the press, and armed organizations. In Louisiana, the Knights of the White Camellia operated as a white supremacist, quasi-military movement. In St. Landry, armed Democrats known as the Seymour Knights took their name from Horatio Seymour, the Democratic presidential nominee running against Grant. Their politics were expressed not only in speeches, but through weapons. One of the people connecting education, publishing, voter registration, and Republican organizing was Emerson Bentley. He was an 18-year-old white teacher from Ohio and the sole instructor at a Freedmen's Bureau school in Opelousas. He taught black children, assisted voter registration, and worked as one of the editors of the Republican newspaper, the St. Landry Progress. The newspaper mattered because it could expose intimidation and circulate a political message. The school mattered because it represented an independent black institution. Bentley's work placed him at the intersection of several changes that white supremacists wanted to reverse. Bentley was not the entire movement, and the massacre should not be reduced to an attack on one white Republican. The political community around him depended on black voters and organizers whose names appear unevenly in the surviving record. His story is unusually visible because federal investigators documented the assault, and because his newspaper work left a public trail. The many black residents killed, displaced, or silenced were the principal targets of the terror, even when official records preserved less about their individual lives. Tension was already high on September 13th, when Republicans marched to a political meeting in the nearby town of Washington. Armed Seymour Knights were present. A gun discharged, but party leaders prevented a larger fight. They negotiated rules meant to reduce the danger. No weapons, no alcohol, and no inflammatory rhetoric at public meetings or in print. The agreement did not hold. On September 28th, 3 white men, John Williams, James R. Dixon, and Constable Sebastian May, confronted Bentley at his school. They objected to his newspaper account of the Washington meeting. Dixon beat Bentley with a cane. The children fled. A false report spread that Bentley had been killed. In fact, he survived, made an affidavit, and went into hiding. Roughly 10 days later, he escaped to New Orleans. Black residents who heard that Bentley was dead had reason to fear that the attack was only the beginning. Armed black men gathered outside Opelousas, including a group at the plantation of Hilaire Paye. A deputized white force ordered them to surrender their weapons. They refused. Gunfire followed. Accounts differ on details of this first encounter. A later U.S. Army history summarizes the exchange as 4 black people killed and 3 white people wounded. Whatever uncertainty remains about the clash, what followed was not a continuing battle between equal forces. White Democrats mobilized in much greater numbers. They seized control of Opelousas. Armed white bands then patrolled the countryside for roughly 2 weeks, pursuing black residents and Republican allies. Reported killings continued into October. People were arrested, disarmed, and taken prisoner. Homes and gathering places were attacked. The Freedmen's Bureau School was ransacked. The press of the St. Landry Progress was destroyed. Black residents fled, hid, or tried to demonstrate that they posed no political threat. The murder of prisoners reveals the nature of the campaign. Black captives were confined in the Opelousas jail. White men later removed prisoners and killed them. Federal investigator Lieutenant Jesse M. Lee confirmed that at least 15 surrendered or captured freedmen were murdered in cold blood. Later histories, drawing on additional evidence, placed the number executed there at 27. These were not combat deaths. The victims were in custody. The killing reached beyond the men involved in the initial exchange. C. E. Durand, the French-language editor of the St. Landry Progress, was murdered. Reports described isolated killings across the parish, shallow graves, and men assigned to bury victims. Some accounts recorded violence against Republicans who had no direct part in the first confrontation. This is why the event is more accurately remembered as a massacre, not simply a riot. There had been an armed clash, but the clash was followed by a sustained campaign in which a far larger white force pursued black residents, executed captives, destroyed Republican institutions, and imposed political control through fear. The precise death toll cannot be recovered from the surviving record. Early Freedmen's Bureau reports counted roughly 20 to 30 black deaths. Other contemporary estimates rose to 200 or 300. A newspaper cited in the Army's history reported more than 100 freed people killed. A National Park Service study gives a scholarly range of 52 to 227. Those differences are not a reason to choose the most dramatic number. They are evidence of the conditions under which the killings occurred. Violence spread across a rural parish. Some bodies went into shallow graves. Witnesses feared retaliation. Local authorities could not be trusted to investigate the men around them. Lieutenant Lee described a quiet reign of terror over the freed people. He also reached a blunt conclusion. The perpetrators of these horrible crimes will not be brought to justice by the civil authorities at Opelousas. The federal response did little to prove him wrong. General Lovell Rousseau sent an officer to investigate, but took no further action. The investigation could record fragments of what had happened. It could not make the survivors safe enough to rebuild their political organization before the election. That failure also shaped the evidence left behind. Lee warned that black witnesses withheld testimony because they feared white vengeance. When people cannot speak without risking their lives, an official report will almost always understate what they know. The incomplete record is therefore not proof that the larger estimates are correct, but neither is it proof that the smaller counts capture the full scale. What can be stated without speculation is that federal investigators found mass murder, understood that fear obstructed testimony, and expected local impunity. The fear did not end when the shooting slowed. Republican leaders had been murdered, assaulted, or driven away. Their newspaper could no longer print. Their school had been attacked. Hundreds of people reportedly fled. White armed men had shown that they could seize prisoners from a jail and kill them without local punishment. Then came November 3, 1868. In the spring election, Republicans had held an actual majority of 628 votes in St. Landry Parish. In November, the official return recorded no votes for Grant. A later congressional account gave all 4,181 registered votes to Seymour, although some later compilations vary slightly on that total. The essential fact does not vary. The official Republican tally was 0. The parish supervisor of registration, Charles B. Montemat, rejected any idea that the result expressed the free choice of the voters. 2 days after the election, he wrote that he was fully convinced no man could have voted any ticket but the Democratic one without being killed within 24 hours. That testimony tells us how to read the return. The 0 was not evidence that black citizens had abandoned politics. It was evidence that political participation had been made deadly. Whatever the degree of advance coordination, the sustained violence functioned as an election strategy. It destroyed the institutions that supported Republican voters, punished visible organizers, and warned everyone else what a ballot might cost. This distinction matters. Historians do not need to prove that every participant followed a single written plan in order to recognize the political function of the violence. Armed groups acted in the name of a party and its presidential candidate. They attacked identifiable Republican people and institutions. Their control continued through the voting period. The result overwhelmingly benefited the political side associated with the attackers. Intent can be debated at the level of each individual killing, but the direction and effect of the campaign are unmistakable. The strategy also reached beyond physical violence. Across Reconstruction, Louisiana, congressional investigators described economic coercion, racial agitation, and quasi-military organization working together. The gun did not replace politics. It helped determine who could safely practice politics at all. Nationally, Grant defeated Seymour and won 213 electoral votes. But Seymour carried Louisiana's 7 electoral votes. St. Landry was part of a broader collapse in the Republican vote under the pressure of statewide terror. Still, the local scope matters. The massacre devastated Republican politics in St. Landry Parish. It did not end black political activity everywhere in Louisiana. Black office holding and organizing continued elsewhere during Reconstruction. Nor did Opelousas alone create the Jim Crow system that emerged over the following decades. Reconstruction continued for years. Congress passed enforcement acts. Federal action disrupted the first Ku Klux Klan. Later came new paramilitary campaigns, court decisions that narrowed federal protection, the retreat of Northern political will, and the white Democratic overthrow of Reconstruction governments, a process its supporters called redemption. Disfranchising laws and segregation hardened afterward into the Jim Crow order. Opelousas was an early demonstration of a method used again across the South. suppress black political power through violence, then convert that victory into control of government and law. It also shows why the language used to remember political violence matters. Calling the event a riot can suggest two groups losing control in a moment of mutual fury. That description obscures the arrests, the prisoner executions, the patrols, the destruction of a newspaper and school, and the coerced election that followed. Known as the Opelousas Massacre, the terror extended far beyond the town into St. Landry Parish. The people it targeted cannot be reduced to a single category. They included voters, editors, organizers, prisoners, and residents caught in the wider campaign. Some resisted with weapons, some ran. Some tried to survive by avoiding politics. What joined their experiences was a system in which white supremacists treated black citizenship itself as a threat. The Spring Majority and the November Zero stand on opposite sides of that violence. One number records the possibility of democratic participation. The other records what happened when armed men were allowed to decide whose vote could reach the ballot box. Remembering Opelousas means refusing to mistake coerced silence for consent. It means seeing the massacre not as an isolated eruption after the Civil War, but as a deliberate assault on the people and institutions that made political freedom real. If you want more overlooked history like this, please like this video and subscribe to The Real Stickman History.